Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are continuing in Erewhon by Samuel Butler. We are on Chapter 10, entitled Current Opinions. And with that, I'll begin. This is what I gathered. That in that country, if a man falls into ill health, or catches any disorder, or fails bodily in any way before he is 70 years old, he is tried before a jury of his countrymen, and if convicted, is held up to public scorn, and sentenced more or less severely as the case may be. There are subdivisions of illnesses into crimes and misdemeanors as with offenses amongst ourselves. A man being punished very heavily for a serious illness, while failure of eyes or hearing in one over 65, who has good health hitherto, is dealt with by fine only, or imprisonment in default of payment. But if a man forges a check, or sets his house on fire, or robs with violence from the person, or does any other such things as are criminal in our own country, he is either taken to a hospital, and most carefully tended at the public expense, or if he is in good circumstances, he lets it be known to all his friends that he is suffering from a severe fit of immorality, just as we do when we are ill. And they come and visit him with great solicitude, and inquire with interest how it all came about, what symptoms first showed themselves, and so forth. Questions which he will answer with perfect unreserve. For bad conduct, though considered no less deplorable than illness within ourselves, and as unquestionably indicating something seriously wrong with the individual who misbehaves, is nevertheless held to be the result of either prenatal or postnatal misfortune. The strange part of the story, however, is that though they ascribe moral defects to the effect of misfortune, either in character or surroundings, they will not listen to the plea of misfortune in cases that in England meet with sympathy and commiseration only. Ill luck of any kind, or even ill treatment at the hands of others, is considered an offense against society, inasmuch as it makes people uncomfortable to hear of it. Loss of fortune, therefore, or loss of some dear friend, on whom another was much dependent, is punished hardly less severely than physical delinquency. Foreign, indeed, as such ideas are to our own, traces of somewhat similar opinions can be found even in 19th century England. If a person has an abscess, the medical man will say that it contains peccant matter, and people say that they have a bad arm or finger, or that they are very bad all over, when they only mean diseased. Among foreign nations, Erewhonian opinions may be still more clearly noted. The Mohammedans, for example, to this day, send their female prisoners to hospitals, and the New Zealand Maoris visit any misfortune with forcible entry into the house of the offender, and the breaking up and burning of all his goods. The Italians, again, use the same word for disgrace and misfortune. I once heard an Italian lady speak of a young friend, whom she described as endowed with every virtue under heaven. Ma, she exclaimed, povero disgrazio, ha ammazzato suo zio. Poor unfortunate fellow, he has murdered his uncle. On mentioning this, which I heard when taken to Italy as a boy by my father, the person to whom I told it showed no surprise. He said that he had been driven for 2 or 3 years in a certain city by a young Sicilian cab driver of prepossessing manners and appearance, but then lost sight of him. On asking what had become of him, he was told that he was in prison for having shot at his father with intent to kill him, happily without serious result. Some years later, my informant again found himself warmly accosted by the prepossessing young cab driver. "My dear sir, it is 5 years since I saw you, 3 years of military service and 2 of misfortune," during which last the poor fellow had been in prison. Of moral sense he showed not so much as a trace. He and his father were now on excellent terms, and were likely to remain so unless either of them should again have the misfortune mortally to offend the other. In the following chapter I will give you a few examples of the way in which what we should call misfortune, hardship, or disease are dealt with by the Erewhonians, but for the moment we'll return to their treatment of cases that with us are criminal. As I have already said, these, though not judiciously punishable, are recognized as requiring correction. Accordingly, there exists a class of men trained in soulcraft, whom they call straighteners, as nearly as I can translate a word which literally means one who bends back the crooked. These men practice much as medical men in England, and receive a quasi-surreptitious fee on every visit. They are treated with the same unreserve and obeyed as readily as our own doctors. That is to say, on the whole sufficiently, because people know that it is their interest to get well as soon as they can, and that they will not be scouted as they would be if their bodies were out of order, even though they may have to undergo a very painful course of treatment. When I say that they will not be scouted, I do not mean that an Erewhonian will suffer no social inconvenience in consequence, we will say, of having committed fraud. Friends will fall away from him because of his being less pleasant company, just as we ourselves are disinclined to make companions of those who are either poor or poorly. No one with any sense of self-respect will place himself on an equality in the matter of affection with those who are less lucky than himself in birth, health, money, good looks, capacity, or anything else. Indeed, that dislike and even disgust should be felt by the fortunate for the unfortunate, or at any rate for those who have been discovered to have met with any of the more serious and less familiar misfortunes, is not only natural, but desirable for any society, whether of man or brute. The fact, therefore, that the Erewhonian attach none of that guilt to crime, which they do to physical ailments, does not prevent the more selfish among them from neglecting a friend who has robbed a bank, for instance, till he has fully recovered. But it does prevent them from even thinking of treating criminals with that contemptuous tone which would seem to say, I, if I were you, should be a better man than you are, a tone which is held quite reasonable in regard to physical ailment. Hence, though they conceal ill health by every cunning and hypocrisy and artifice which they can devise, they are quite open about the most flagrant mental diseases, should they happen to exist, which, to do the people justice, is not often. Indeed, there are some who are, so to speak, spiritual valetudinarians, and who make themselves exceedingly ridiculous by their nervous supposition that they are wicked, while they are very tolerable people all the time. This, however, is exceptional, and on the very whole they use much the same reserve or unreserve about the state of their moral welfare as we do about our health. Hence, all the ordinary greetings among ourselves, such as "How do you do?" and the like, are considered signs of gross ill-breeding, nor do the politer class tolerate even such a common complimentary remark as telling a man that he is looking well. They salute each other with, "I hope you are good this morning," or "I hope you have recovered from the snappishness from which you were suffering when I last saw you," and if the person saluted has not been good or is still snappish, he says so at once, and is condoled with accordingly. Indeed, the straighteners have gone so far as to give names from the hypothetical language, as taught at the colleges of unreason, to all known forms of mental indisposition, and to classify them according to a system of their own, which, though I could not understand it, seems to work well in practice, for they are always able to tell a man what is the matter with him as soon as they have heard his story, and their familiarity with the long names assures him that they thoroughly understand his case. The reader will have no difficulty in believing that the laws regarding ill health were frequently evaded by the help of recognized fictions, which everyone understood, but by which would be considered gross ill-breeding to even seem to understand. Thus, a day or two after my arrival at the Nosnibors, one of the many ladies who called on me made excuses for her husband's only sending his card, on the ground that when going through the public marketplace that morning he had stolen a pair of socks. I had already been warned that I should never show surprise, so I merely expressed my sympathy, and said that though I had only been in the capital so short a time, I had already had a very narrow escape from stealing a clothes brush, and that though I had resisted temptation so far, I was sadly afraid that if I saw any object of special interest that was neither too hot nor too heavy, I should have put myself in the straightener's hands. Mrs. Nosnibor, who had been keeping an ear on all that I had been saying, praised me when the lady had gone. Nothing, she said, could have been more polite according to Erewhonian etiquette. She then explained that to have stolen a pair of socks, or to have the socks in more colloquial language, was a recognized way of saying that the person in question was slightly indisposed. In spite of all this, they have a keen sense of the enjoyment consequent upon what they call being well. They admire mental health and love it in other people, and take all pains they can, consistently with their other duties, to secure it for themselves. They have an extreme dislike to marrying into what they consider unhealthy families. They send for the straightener at once whenever they have been guilty of anything seriously flagitious, often even if they think that they are on the point of committing it. And though his remedies are sometimes exceedingly painful, involving close confinement for weeks, and in some cases the most cruel physical tortures, I never heard of a reasonable Erewhonian refusing to do what his straightener told him, any more than of a reasonable Englishman refusing to undergo even the most frightful operation if his doctors told him it was necessary. We in England never shrink from telling our doctor what is the matter with us, merely through the fear that he will hurt us. We let him do his worst upon us, and stand it without murmur, because we are not scouted for being ill, and because we know that the doctor is doing his best to cure us, and that he can judge of our case better than we can. But we should conceal an illness if we were treated as the Erewhonians are when they have anything the matter with them. We should do the same as with moral and intellectual diseases. We should feign health with the most consummate art till we were found out, and should hate a single flogging given in the way of mere punishment more than the amputation of a limb, if it were kindly and courteously performed from a wish to help us out of our difficulty, and with the full consciousness on the part of the doctor that it was only by an accident of constitution that he was not in the like plight himself. So the Erewhonians take a flogging once a week, and a diet of bread and water for 2 or 3 months together whenever their straightener recommends it. I do not suppose that even my host, on having swindled a confiding widow out of the whole of her property, was put to more actual suffering than a man will readily undergo at the hands of an English doctor. And yet he must have had a very bad time of it. The sounds I heard were sufficient to show that his pain was exquisite, but he never shrank from undergoing it. He was quite sure that it did him good, and I think he was right. I cannot believe that man will ever embezzle money again. He may, but it will be a long time before he does so. During my confinement in prison, and on my journey, I had already discovered a great deal of the above, but it still seemed surpassingly strange, and I was in constant fear of committing some piece of rudeness through my inability to look at things from the same standpoint as my neighbors. But after a few weeks' stay in the Nosnibors, I got to understand things better, especially on having heard all about my host's illness, of which he told me fully and repeatedly. It seemed that he had been on the stock exchange of the city for many years, and had amassed enormous wealth, without exceeding the limits of what was generally considered justifiable, or at any rate permissible dealing. But at length, on several occasions, he had become aware of a desire to make money by fraudulent representations, and had actually dealt with 2 or 3 sums in a way which had made him rather uncomfortable. He had unfortunately made light of it, and pooh-poohed the ailment until circumstances eventually presented themselves which enabled him to cheat upon a very considerable scale. He told me what they were, and they were about as bad as anything could be, but I need not detail them. He seized the opportunity and became aware, when it was too late, that he must be seriously out of order. He had neglected himself too long. He drove home at once, broke the news to his wife and daughters as gently as he could, and sent off for one of the most celebrated straighteners of the kingdom to a consultation with a family practitioner, for the case was plainly serious. On the arrival of the straightener, he told his story, and expressed his fear that his morals must be permanently impaired. The eminent man reassured him with a few cheering words, and then proceeded to make a more careful diagnosis of the case. He inquired concerning Mr. Nosnibor's parents. Had their health been good? He was answered that there had not been anything seriously amiss with them, but that his maternal grandfather, whom he was supposed to resemble somewhat in person, had been a consummate scoundrel, and had ended his days in a hospital. while a brother of his father's, having led a most flagitious life for many years, had been at last cured by a philosopher of a new school, which, as far as I could understand it, bore much the same relation to the old as homeopathy to allopathy. The straightener shook his head at this, and laughingly replied that the cure must have been due to nature. After a few more questions, he wrote a prescription and departed. I saw the prescription. It ordered a fine to the state of double the money embezzled, no food but bread and milk for 6 months, and a severe flogging once a month for 12. I was surprised to see that no part of the fine was to be paid to the poor woman whose money had been embezzled, but on the inquiry I learned that she would have been prosecuted in the misplaced confidence court if she had not escaped its clutches by dying shortly after she had discovered her loss. As for Mr. Nosnibor, he had received his 11th flogging on the day of my arrival. I saw him later on this same afternoon, and he was still twinged, but there had been no escape from following out the straightener's prescription, for the so-called sanitary laws of Erewhon are very rigorous, and unless the straightener was satisfied that his orders had been obeyed, the patient would have been taken to a hospital, as the poor are, and would have been much worse off. Such at least is the law, but it is never necessary to enforce it. On a subsequent occasion, I was present at an interview between Mr. Nosnibor and the family straightener, who was considered competent to watch the completion of the cure. I was struck with the delicacy with which he avoided even the remotest semblance of inquiry after the physical well-being of his patient, though there was a certain yellowness about my host's eyes which argued a bilious habit of body. To have taken notice of this would have been a gross breach of professional etiquette. I was told, however, that a straightener sometimes thinks it right to glance at the possibility of some slight physical disorder if he finds it important to order to assist in his diagnosis. But the answers which he gets are generally untrue or evasive, and he forms his own conclusions upon the matter as well as he can. Sensible men have been known to say that the straightener should in strict confidence be told of every physical ailment that is likely to bear upon the case. But people are naturally shy of doing this, for they do not like lowering themselves in the opinion of the straightener, and his ignorance of medical science is supreme. I heard of one lady, indeed, who had the hardihood to confess that a furious outbreak of ill humor and extravagant fancies for which she was seeking advice was possibly the result of indisposition. "You should resist that," said the straightener in a kind but grave voice. "We can do nothing for the bodies of our patients. Such matters are beyond our province, and I desire that I may hear no further particulars." The lady burst into tears and promised faithfully that she would never be unwell again. But to return to Mr. Nosnibor. As the afternoon wore on, many carriages drove up with callers to inquire how he had stood his flogging. It had been very severe, but the kind inquiries upon every side gave him great pleasure, and he assured me that he felt almost tempted to do wrong again by the solicitude with which his friends had treated him during his recovery. And this I need hardly say that he was not serious. During the remainder of my stay in the country, Mr. Nosnibor was constantly attentive to his business, and largely increased his already great possessions. But I never heard a whisper to the effect of his having been indisposed a second time, or made money by other than the most strictly honorable means. I did hear afterwards in confidence that there had been reason to believe that his health had been not a little affected by the straightener's treatment, but his friends did not choose to be over-curious upon the subject, and on his return to his affairs, it was by common consent passed over as hardly criminal in one who was otherwise so much afflicted, for they regard bodily ailments as the more venial in proportion as they have been produced by causes independent of the constitution. Thus, if a person ruin his health by excessive indulgence at the table or by drinking, they count it to be almost a part of mental disease, which brought it about, and so it goes for a little, but they have no mercy on such illnesses as fevers or catarrhs or lung diseases, which to us appear to be beyond the control of the individual. They are only more lenient towards the diseases of the young, such as measles, which they think to be like sowing one's wild oats, and look over them as pardonable indiscretions, if they have not been too serious, and if they are atoned for by complete subsequent recovery. It is hardly necessary to say that the office of straightener is one which requires long and special training. It stands to reason that he who would cure a moral ailment must be practically acquainted with it in all its bearings. The student for the profession of straightener is required to set apart certain seasons for the practice of each vice in turn as a religious duty. These are called fasts, and are continued by the student until he finds that he can really subdue all the more usual vices in his own person, and hence can advise his patients from the results of his own experience. Those who intend to be specialists rather than general practitioners devote themselves more particularly to the branch in which their practice will mainly lie. Some students have been obliged to continue their exercises during their whole lives, and some devoted men have actually died as martyrs to the drink, or gluttony, or whatever branch of vice they may have chosen for their especial study. The greater number, however, take no harm by the excursions into the various departments of vice which it is incumbent upon them to study. For the Erewhonians hold that unalloyed virtue is not a thing to be immoderately indulged in. I was shown more than one case in which the real or supposed virtues of parents were visited upon the children to the third and fourth generation. The straighteners say that most that can be truly said for virtue is that there is a considerable balance in its favor, and that is on the whole a good deal better to be on its side than against it. But they urge that there is much pseudo-virtue going about, which is apt to let people in very badly before they find it out. Those men, they say, are best who are not remarkable either for vice or virtue. I told them about Hogarth's idle and industrious apprentices, but they did not seem to think that the industrious apprentice was a very nice person. Chapter 11. Some Erewhonian Trials. In Erewhon, as in other countries, there are some courts of justice that deal with special subjects. Misfortune generally, as I have above explained, is considered more or less criminal. But it admits of classification, and a court is assigned to each of the main heads under which it can be supposed to fall. Not very long after I had reached the capital, I strolled into the personal bereavement court, and was both much interested and pained by listening to the trial of a man who was accused of having just lost a wife to whom he had been tenderly attached, and who had left him with 3 little children, of whom the eldest was only 3 years old. The defense with which the prisoner's counsel endeavored to establish was that the prisoner had never really loved his wife, but it broke down completely, for the public prosecutor called witness after witness who deposed to the fact that the couple had been really devoted to one another, and the prisoner repeatedly wept as incidents were put in evidence that reminded him of the irreparable nature of the loss he had sustained. The jury returned a verdict of guilty after very little deliberation, but recommended the prisoner to mercy on the ground that he had but recently insured his wife's life of a considerable sum, and might be deemed lucky inasmuch as he had received the money without demur from the insurance company, though he had only paid 2 premiums. I have just said that the jury found the prisoner guilty. When the judge passed sentence, I was struck with the way in which the prisoner's counsel was rebuked for having referred to a work in which the guilt of such misfortunes as the prisoner's was extenuated to a degree that roused the indignation of the court. "We shall have," said the judge, "these crude and subversionary books from time to time until it is recognized as an axiom of morality that luck is the only fit object of human veneration. How far a man has any right to be more lucky, and hence more venerable than his neighbors, is a point that always has been, and always will be settled proximately by a kind of higgling and haggling of the market, and ultimately by brute force. But however this may be, it stands to reason that no man should be allowed to be unlucky to more than a very moderate extent." Then, turning to the prisoner, the judge continued, "You have suffered a great loss. Nature attaches a severe penalty to such offenses, and human law must emphasize the decrees of nature. But for the recommendation of the jury, I should have given you 6 months' hard labor. I will, however, commute your sentence to 1 or 3 months, with the option of a fine of 25% on the money you have received from the insurance company." The prisoner thanked the judge, and said that as he had no one to look after his children, If he was sent to prison, he would embrace the option mercifully permitted him by his lordship and pay the sum he had named. He was then removed from the dock. The next case was that of a youth barely arrived at man's estate, who was charged with having been swindled out of large property during his minority by his guardian, who was also one of his nearest relations. His father had been long dead, and it was for this reason that his offense came on for trial in the personal bereavement court. The lad, who was undefended, pleaded that he was young, inexperienced, greatly in awe of his guardian, and without independent professional advice. "Young man," said the judge sternly, "do not talk nonsense. People have no right to be young, inexperienced, greatly in awe of their guardians, and without independent professional advice. If by such indiscretions they outrage the moral sense of their friends, they must expect to suffer accordingly." He then ordered the prisoner to apologize to his guardian, and to receive 12 strokes with the cat of 9 tails. But I shall perhaps best convey to the reader an idea of the entire perversion of thought which exists among the extraordinary people, by describing the public trial of a man who was accused of pulmonary consumption, an offense which was punished with death until quite recently. It did not occur till I had been some months in the country, and I am deviating from chronological order and giving it here. But I had perhaps better do so in order that I may exhaust this subject before proceeding to others. Moreover, I should never come to an end were I to keep to a strictly narrative form, and detail the infinite absurdities with which I daily came in contact. The prisoner was placed in the dock, and the jury were sworn much as in Europe. Almost all of our modes of procedure were reproduced, even to the requiring the prisoner to plead guilty or not guilty. He pleaded not guilty, and the case proceeded. The evidence for the prosecution was very strong, but I must do the court the justice to observe the trial was absolutely impartial. Counsel for the prisoner was allowed to urge everything that could be said in his defense. The line was taken that the prisoner was simulating consumption in order to defraud an insurance company from which he was about to buy an annuity, and that he hoped thus to obtain it on more advantageous terms. If this could have been shown to be the case, he would have escaped a criminal prosecution and been sent to a hospital as for a moral ailment. The view, however, was one which could not be reasonably sustained, in spite of all the ingenuity and eloquence of one of the most celebrated advocates of the country. The case was only too clear, for the prisoner was almost at the point of death, and it was astonishing that he had been tried and convicted long previously. His coughing was incessant during the whole trial, and it was all that the 2 jailers in charge of him could do to keep him on his legs until it was over. The summing up of the judge was admirable. He dwelt upon every point that could be construed in favor of the prisoner, but as he proceeded it became clear that the evidence was too convincing to admit of doubt, and there was but one opinion in the court as to the impending verdict when the jury retired from the box. They were absent for about 10 minutes, and on their return the foreman pronounced the prisoner guilty. There was a faint murmur of applause, but it was instantly repressed. The judge then proceeded to pronounce sentence in words which I can never forget, and which I copied out into a notebook next day from the report that was published in the leading newspaper. I must condense it somewhat, and nothing which I could say would give more than a faint idea of the solemn, not to say majestic severity with which it was delivered. The sentence was as follows. Prisoner at the bar, you have been accused of the great crime of laboring under pulmonary consumption, and after an impartial trial before a jury of your own countrymen, you have been found guilty. Against the justice of the verdict, I can say nothing. The evidence against you was conclusive, and it only remains for me to pass such a sentence upon you as shall satisfy the ends of the law. That sentence must be a very severe one. It pains me very much to see one who was yet so young, and whose prospects in life were otherwise so excellent, brought to this distressing condition by a constitution which I can only regard as radically vicious. But yours is no case for compassion. This is not your first offense. You have led a career of crime, and have only profited by the leniency shown you upon past occasions to offend yet more seriously against the laws and institutions of your country. You were convicted of aggravated bronchitis last year. And I find that though you are now only 23 years old, and you have been imprisoned no less than 14 occasions for illnesses of a more or less hateful character, in fact, it is not too much to say that you have spent the greater part of your life in a jail. It is all very well for you to say that you came of unhealthy parents, and had a severe accident in your childhood which permanently undermined your constitution. Excuses such as these are the ordinary refuge of the criminal, but they cannot for one moment be listened to by the ear of justice. I am not here to enter upon curious metaphysical questions as to the origin of this or that, questions to which there would be no end were their introduction once tolerated, and which would result in throwing the only guilt on the tissues of the primordial cell or on the elementary gases. There is no question of how you came to be wicked, but only this, namely, are you wicked or not? This has been decided in the affirmative. Neither can I hesitate for a single moment to say that it has been decided justly. You are a bad and dangerous person, and stand branded in the eyes of your fellow countrymen with one of the most heinous known offenses. It is not my business to justify the law. The law may in some cases have its inevitable hardships, and I may feel regret at times that I have not the option of passing a less severe sentence than I am compelled to do. But yours is no such case. On the contrary, had not the capital punishment for consumption been abolished, I should certainly inflict it now. It is intolerable that an example of such terrible enormity should be allowed to go at large, unpunished. Your presence in the society of respectable people would lead the less able-bodied to think more lightly of all forms of illness. Neither can it be permitted that you should have the chance of corrupting unborn beings who might hereafter pester you. The unborn must not be allowed to come near you, and this is not so much for their protection, for they are our natural enemies, as for our own. For since they were not utterly gainsaid, it must be seen to that they be quartered upon those who are at least likely to corrupt them. But independently of this consideration, and independently of the physical guilt which attaches itself to a crime so great as yours, there is yet another reason why we should be unable to show you mercy, even if we were inclined to do so. I refer to the existence of a class of men who lie hidden among us, and who are called physicians. Were the severity of the law or the current feeling of the country to be relaxed never so slightly, these abandoned persons, who are now compelled to practice secretly, and who can be consulted only at the greatest risk, would become frequent visitors in every household. Their organization and their intimate acquaintance with all family secrets would give them a power, both social and political, which nothing could resist. The head of the household would become subordinate to the family doctor, who would interfere between man and wife, between master and servant, until the doctor should be the only depositories of power in the nation, and have all that we hold precious at their mercy. A time of universal dephysicalization would ensue. Medicine vendors of all kinds would abound in our streets, and advertise in all our newspapers. There is one remedy for this, and one only. It is that which the laws of this country have long received and acted upon, and consists in the sternest repression of all diseases whatsoever, as soon as their existence is made manifest to the eye of the law. Would that the eye were far more piercing than it is. But I will enlarge no further upon things that are themselves so obvious. You may say that it is not your fault. The answer is ready enough at hand, and it amounts to this: that if you had been born of healthy and well-to-do parents, and been well taken care of when you were a child, you would never have offended against the laws of your country, nor found yourself in the present disgraceful position. If you tell me that you had no hand in your parentage and education, and that it is therefore unjust to lay these things to your charge, I answer that whether your being in a consumption is your fault or no, it is a fault in you, and it is my duty to see that against such faults as this, the Commonwealth shall be protected. You may say that it is your misfortune to be criminal. I answer that it is your crime to be unfortunate. Lastly, I should point out that even though the jury had acquitted you, a supposition that I cannot seriously entertain, I should have felt it my duty to inflict a sentence hardly less severe than that which I must pass at present. For the more you had been found guiltless of the crime imputed to you, the more you would have been found guilty of one hardly less heinous. I mean the crime of having been maligned unjustly. I do not hesitate, therefore, to sentence you to imprisonment with hard labor for the rest of your miserable existence. During that period, I would earnestly entreat you to repent of the wrongs that you have done already, and to entirely reform the constitution of your whole body. I entertain but little hope that you will pay attention to my advice. You are already far too abandoned. Did it rest with myself, I should add nothing in mitigation of the sentencing which I have passed. But it is the merciful provision of the law that even the most hardened criminal shall be allowed some one of the 3 official remedies, which is to be prescribed at the time of his conviction. I shall therefore order that you receive 2 tablespoonsful of castor oil daily until the pleasure of the court be further known. When the sentence was concluded, the prisoner acknowledged in a few scarcely audible words that he was justly punished, and that he had had a fair trial. He was then removed to the prison from which he was never to return. There was a second attempt at applause when the judge had finished speaking, but as before it was at once repressed. And though the feeling of the court was strongly against the prisoner, there was no show of any violence against him, if one may accept the little hooting from the bystanders when he was being removed in the prisoner's van. Indeed, nothing struck me more during my whole sojourn in the country than the general respect for law and order. This is the end of chapters 10 and 11 of Erewhon by Samuel Butler. Thank you for listening.